In part 3 of this series, we want to have a look at a complete different kind of modeling method. Although it's maybe not completely different, but it's another approach compared to the polygon approach we saw in the first episode. And to illustrate you a little bit further what we're doing, so of course, like the name and the title of this lecture is called Splines. We're going to use splines to model our objects. And I showed you this illustration before where we talked about doing parametric modeling, where we can use simple objects or build simple objects, but very, very simple objects. And then we have, on the other hand, a polygon modeling where we could basically build everything we liked with a detailed object. And the spline modeling method is somewhat in between. It allows us to basically take the parametric modeling approach one step further and design our own parametric objects. And they can be, or the shapes which we can design with more freely, or there are very few limitations basically. So yeah, we can use this method to do quite a bit more modeling. And then also this method can be like a stepstone towards polygon modeling. So again, you can use the spline modeling method to create your own objects, then transform them to a polygon object, and then go from there and edit it a bit further. And we'll have maybe one or two examples covering this. So first of all, what is a spline? A spline is basically nothing different than a Bezier curve or a path. You know this from any 2D illustration program like Photoshop or Illustrator or Figma or whatever. So yeah, it's a parametric curve. It has those control points and those control tangents. And just a random side fact here, it was first introduced or used by Pierre Bezier to design Renault cars. So that's where the name of the Bezier curve comes from. And in this course, we will also have a look at other kind of splines or curves. So the Bezier curve is not the only one. There are also different ones. But the Bezier curve is very good to work with in a 2D or even a 3D environment. Because it's easy to manipulate by using the control points and the control tangents. So just to get on the same page here, you use the control points to define basically the shape of the object you like to build, and you use the tangents to define the curving, or yeah, the curving of the control point in order to get this kind of shape. Yeah, and we have with splines actually the same thing as with the primitives or the parametric objects in 3D space. We have those as well in the more or less 2D space of splines. So when I refer to 2D, that basically means usually the 2D or a spline is defined in a 2D space. It's a 2D shape, whereas our primitive or parametric objects are 3D shapes. Still, you can, of course, use those 2D shapes in our 3D environment in Cinema 4D, and we will see how we can use those splines to generate 3D objects. And speaking of it, this is how it's going to work in basic terms. So we have a spline, for example, this kind of shape. It's two-dimensional, but it is placed in our 3D space. And then you should imagine something like an axis, a symmetry axis going through this kind of point on our object. And then we use a tool to, for example, make a 360-degree rotation and projection of this kind of shape to generate this kind of object. And in later versions of Cinema 4D, these kind of generators and objects, they have been called NURBS object. And NURBS, you might see them also in other 3D programs. This is why I mentioned this. It stands for non-uniform rational B-spline. So it's quite a complicated name. It isn't so complicated to understand, and we will cover the non-uniform rational B-spline a little bit later in another modeling technique. But for now, you can just basically ignore the NURBS term and just remember spline generators to generate from a 2D spline a 3D object like this kind of bowl, for example. you find 4 different types of spline generators inside of Cinema 4D. We have the extrude, the lathe, the loft, and the sweep. And every one of those has a particular task and how they will transform or generate the 3D object out of your 2D spline. And this is what they're doing. We will have a look now inside of Cinema 4D to give you a quick overview of what they're doing. And then we have a bit of a closer look into the methods of using splines and how to work with splines. So switching back to Cinema 4D here, as mentioned on the slides, this is where you find the spline objects. You see there are different types of them. Usually we have rectangular, circle. It's basically the same as the cube and the cylinder. But there are a few more. We even have like an empty spline where we can draw our own spline. And then down here we have the generators: extrude, lathe, loft, and sweep. So let's throw them in here and we will cover them step by step. And yeah, oh, that was the wrong one. So we're gonna have to do the sweep. Let's start with the simplest one, the extrude, and let's quickly switch back to the slide to see what the Cinema 4D help actually tells us about it. So this is taken from the Cinema 4D help files. So the extrude object extrudes a spline to create an object with depth. Okay, that sounds simple, and it actually is. So let's say we have this kind of star shape here. As you can see, this is placed in our scene. 2D shape, so there's no real 3D geometry generated here. But as soon as we drop this into the extrude, you can see the extrude object generates this kind of star shape here. Again, just as a quick note here, this parametric spline object, you can change the parameters here. It's the same as with the parametric 3D objects. And yeah, you can actually do something like this, twist, for example. And let's have a look at the extrude. The extrude is very simple also to set up. We have the direction, which is at the auto mode, but we can also define the axis we like to push this out from, or to basically the extrude direction. So the Z direction, that will be the blue axis, and you can see we can push this out as much as we like to. Then we have a cap setting, so we can decide if we want to have caps here or not. Yeah, so that's basically all there is to the extrude. You can use a 2D shape and use the extrude to extrude your shape. Quick little tip here as a shortcut: you can use the Q button on your keyboard to activate or deactivate the selected generator. That's true for all generators, but in this case it's particularly useful. So for example, if you want to work on your 2D shape, just press Q to deactivate it and then press Q again to activate it again. Okay. So that's the extrude. Let's go to the loft as a next example. And the loft object stretches a skin over 2 or more splines. So first thing to remember here, we need at least 2 splines. And the order of the splines in the loft object determines the sequence in which they are connected. So the order also plays a role in the kind of object we like to build here. So maybe we build something like displayed here on this little icon. Let me hide the extrude for a second. So first thing we want to do is we want to add a circle and we want to add a rectangle. Let's place those both in the X and Z plane. Same with the circle. And now we move the circle up a little bit, and let's duplicate that circle by holding the Command or Control key, moving this up, and then going to the settings over here of the circle, we scale this down to something smaller. And then let's throw them in the loft. And as you can see, this kind of messed up. It's kind of not the way we like it to be, and this is because we have to pay attention to the order in here. So we have to arrange it in the way our objects are placed in the scene, or in a way on how we like to basically make the skin around this. So if this is the object which is at the bottom, this should go first in here, and then the one in the middle, the second, and then the other one at the top. So it doesn't necessarily play a role if you do it like this, or it shouldn't at least. It's the same as if I do this. So same thing, but in general it plays a role in which kind of order those are placed. So maybe let's rotate this thing a little bit. And as you can see, what this loft thing does, it kind of creates a skin around our shape, or our shapes rather. So it's a good way to, I didn't want to hide it, I want to deactivate it, to use this kind of hull geometry to create the actual hull. It's a bit like in building ships or aeroplanes, where you use this kind of construction method to build those. Okay, that's the loft. Let's hide this, jump back to our keynote, and let's have a look at the sweep. The sweep object requires 2 splines again, but this time only 2 splines, not more. The first spline, the contour spline, defines the cross section and is swept along the second spline, the path to create the object. Sounds maybe a little complicated, but it isn't actually. Here's an important note. The contour spline should lie on the local X and Y plane. So what does this mean? Let's say we want to create a contour spline that could be, for example, this kind of cogwheel. Again, nice little tool here to create cogwheels. That would be our contour plane, and it should lie on the Y and X plane, or X and Y. Yeah. Okay. Now the next thing we need a spline which will define the way on which this cross section is swept along. So basically the path on which the contour is swept along. And what we mean by swept you will see in a second. So let's create a spline, and you can use this kind of spline pen tool over here, and maybe switch to a top position, top window, so that we have the view from the top. And now I just click and drag a little bit to create something like this. So just a simple kind of shape, and you just click, move your mouse, click and hold again to draw the tangent for the spline. It's actually the same thing as in Illustrator or Figma, just click and drag. You should be used to this as soon, or at least if you're used to using this kind of splines in other programs. Okay, so let's switch back to our 3D view. You see we have the contour, we have the path, and now we have to drop them in our generator. First goes the contour, and then goes the path, and something like this. So let me deactivate the lines, and as you can see, we can generate something like this, which looks a bit like, I don't know, rigatoni, or I don't know the exact name of this kind of pasta thing, but I think you know what I mean. Could also be toothpaste or something. This is actually good to build everything like cables or any other kind of shape which should follow a path and which has a certain kind of round shape to it, or which goes this way. So for example, I could also use, of course, a circle in here and then have a smooth rounding shape, for example, to recreate a cable or pipe or something like this. Okay, that's the sweep. Let's have a quick look at the options for the sweep. Actually, we didn't cover the loft object too much, but it's really simple. Again, with the loft, we have the caps option to turn them on and off, and then you can define how many subdivisions you want to have. So let me just jump back here to cover this so that nothing is left out. And as you can see, I can define basically the amount of segments with this kind of tool. The other options are not too important and not too life-changing. So let's go back to the sweep, which has a few more nice options. So for example, we can define the end scale to make something like a tail from a rat or something. We can also change the start and end growth. So for example, we can do something like this. So we can define how much this should be filled. So for example, imagine we have a pipe and we want to put some liquid in the pipe and simulate that. We could do this with two of those kind of sweep objects, one inside of the other, and then we could do something like a growing effect in this. Also as a start growth, and then we have a rotation that doesn't make sense if we have a round circle-like shape here. So let's throw in the cogwheel again, and let's turn off the grout shading lines, and let's rotate the end here a little bit so you can create this kind of helix effect. All right. Now maybe a word about the spline here, about the path. If you click on the spline, you can see that's basically now the shape for the editable spline. That's not a parametric spline anymore. So when I go to the cogwheel and I would make that editable, it would be the same kind of editable spline object. What we can do here is we can define the amount of intermediate points this kind of object has. So as you can see, this is quite smoothed out around it, and it's because we have set this to a quite low angle here. Let me change this to another setting, for example to uniform, and then decrease the amount of points. As you can see, there's no change, but as you can see, if I activate the sweep object again, there's actually something you see. So when looking at the spline itself, it will show as very rounded, but if you go back and activate your sweep object, and then we can actually use the amount of points in between here to define how rounded or how smooth this is. So if we go back to the adaptive kind of thing, you can see if I increase the angle here, you can see how this is changing the kind of segmentation of our spline. So if you go to a very low value, you can see this is smoothened out. Okay, just wanted to cover this kind of setting here, and then you have the type, and you can see there are quite a few different type of curves, but we covered this in another session. Just the way maybe you by accident hit this kind of type thing, and something looks off or something looks like this, where the point is actually not even on the curve, then yeah, you can go back here and change this to the Bezier curve, and by that have your usual curve back. Okay, let's cover the last one, the lathe object, and let's have a look at the description. The lathe object rotates a spline about or around the y-axis of the local axis system of the generator object to generate a surface of revolution. For example, you can create a wine glass from a simple profile. Okay, let's try that out. Let's go back to Cinema, and I only want to do this very roughly now. So we have an example where we actually do a wine bottle or a wine glass, whatever you like. The example is from a wine bottle, so let's have a look at the wine glass, but very simplified in this kind of version. Okay, so we go to the spline pen again, and we go to the, I guess it doesn't matter too much, it should be the right or the front perspective, and then you have to imagine the profile of a wine glass. So let's maybe start here on the top, and maybe let's do a quite like geometric kind of edgy shape wine glass. So we do the outside of the top part, then we do a little bit of rounding here, go to this direction, and I think I started a little bit too far out, so we will move this back in a second. So let's do it like maybe like this, and then go straight down, and maybe a little bit further, and then we kind of start to get to our like bottom kind of shape here. Okay, maybe zoom in a little bit because it's quite a tight space down here. And now let's go to the center here. All right, now you can hit escape to deselect this kind of thing, and now we have to work a little bit on our proportions, so kind of messed up here a little bit. So let's move this thing up a little bit, and now select all, Command A, and now move this really close to the basic center of your coordinate system. So we want to have this very close, and we can even go and select this point, go to the coordinates tab, and actually no, that doesn't quite work. Okay, I have had selected something else. So we can use the coordinates manager here to really set this kind of point to the 0 position of our coordinate system, so it's right in the center here. Okay, I think we can maybe move this out a little bit. So just eyeballing here, it's I don't know, we have to see if it's the 3D shape in a second to see how that works out. So there's a little bit of bump here, I guess, but should be okay. The stem of this wine glass might be a big, but yeah, it's just a quick demonstration so that you get the idea of what we can do with this kind of profiles. That would be the profile of the wine glass, and this goes into the lathe, and then we get our wine glass. Isn't too bad. Like I said, the stem is a little bit too big, but the sweet thing now is we can just select our points and we can just move them more to the inside to make this smaller, like so. Yeah, so that's the thing with the lathe. You use a profile of the shape you'd like to recreate, and then it will be rotated 360 degrees around the local axis of your lathe object. So if I move this to here, the rotation will happen at this place. So it will always take the local X and Y coordinate system to rotate 360 degrees. So just as a good rule of thumb, or a good thing to note, is that you should just keep it in the 0 position of your coordinate system, in the root position, and then it will not mess up. Okay, in the other episodes of this lecture number 3, we will have a look a little bit more detailed on how to use the splines and how to use reference images to create the objects we like.